Okay, let's get started. We're at about 11:31. I think more people might join throughout, but that's okay. So welcome everyone to Canada's Feminist Budget and Intersectional Debrief, brought to you by Canadian Equality Consulting, YWCA Canada, and the Canadian Women's Foundation. My name is Marcy Hronik, and my pronouns are she, her. And I am very thankful that you all took time out of your busy day to join us to dissect this really important federal budget. And just before we begin, we'll start with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. And although we meet on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land that we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations that call this nation home. So thank you again for joining. Canadian Equality is a strategy firm that supports any workplace or organization to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm in Calgary, or in Treaty 7 territory and Métis Nation Region 3. We have consultants across the country in Vancouver and Toronto, and serve clients around the globe. And we'd love to also hear from you. So if you don't mind writing in the chat a little introduction of yourself and where you're situated, and if you know the treaty lands, please feel free to also include that. So this is a very exciting budget that we're here to dissect. It is a recovery plan for jobs, growth, and resilience. It is Canada's first pandemic budget and tabled by Canada's first woman finance minister, Chrystia Freeland. And the finance minister herself said it is Canada's first feminist budget, which creates pretty high expectations. So we wanted to dig into this a little deeper with these brilliant women here today to see how feminist this budget really is, and is it intersectional? What might be missing, and what would be recommended to improve it? So now for some folks in attendance, you may be asking, what is intersectional, or what does that mean? So quickly, intersectionality is a framework developed by US scholar Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw to understand how components of our identities interact and intersect in unique ways to create experiences of privilege, discrimination, or oppression. So for example, when trying to advance gender equality, if we were to focus on women only, we wouldn't fully understand the complexity of the challenges, the barriers, or lived experiences, because women aren't a homogeneous group and we're not a monolith. So we need to take an intersectional approach to consider experiences of Indigenous women, of women living with a disability, of lower income senior women, etc. So layering multiple identity factors together to expose barriers, challenges, and opportunities. So intersectionality is this effective framework to uncover and fully understand complex issues so that we can more effectively solve them. So saying that, we have a prime minister that is a feminist and has wanted to advance gender equality as one of his legacies. And the government of Canada uses a gender-based budgeting tool since 2016 with the Gender Budgeting Act. They use gender-based analysis plus, or GBA plus, and they run the budget through and apply that lens when they're designing it. So how does it shape up? So we've gathered Anjum Sultana, the National Director, Public Policy, Advocacy, and Strategic Communications at YWCA Canada, Sheila North, former Grand Chief, Kiwatanawi Okimakanek, and Karen Campbell, Director of Community Initiatives and Policy from the Canadian Women's Foundation, to share their insights, surprises, and recommendations related to the newly released budget. So I've been to, in the past, when everything was in person, a lot of other budget breakfasts and budget debriefs that are typically held. And I can't think of one that I've ever been to where all of the panelists and expert commentators were women. So this feels really exciting and hopeful and really special. And building off of that, to get us started, I'd love to ask everyone to share quickly what it meant to you to see a woman for the first time present the federal budget. So we'll start with Sheila, then Karen, then Anjum.
Yes, thank you for having me, and thank you to all the organizers, and hello to all of you. I'm here in the Treaty 2 territory, also homeland of the Métis Nation. And yes, I was very pleased to see Chrystia Freeland presenting the budget as a woman and as a mother. And I saw her in one of the, I think it was on CTV, I think Lisa LaFlamme asked her, what was it like for you to deliver this budget? And the daycare, and she acknowledged herself that that maybe it came out this way because she is a woman and because she is a mother. So I was really happy to see that she acknowledged the obvious, even though all of us noticed it. I'm glad that she's not shying away from that in any way, and neither is the government. So it was very, very good to see, a very hopeful. But as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous woman, I'm always cautiously optimistic. Sometimes for me, it's just optics. I hope it's not. I'm looking forward and will look to great optimism that things will, turn out better for women and this she session as we go forward. But for now, I'm really pleased that she is there and that she presented the budget that she did with many good things that appear to be coming for women.
Great. Karen.
Thanks, Marcy. And hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today, joining you from London, Ontario, on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Arawandran peoples. And great to be on this panel with Anjum and Sheila. And I agree with Sheila. It was really hopeful to see Chrystia Freeland in that role. I think it's always important to see women in high-level positions like this. It's great for young people in the sense of, if you can see it, you can be it. And it's unsurprising, I think, in a lot of ways that with her in this role, we were able to see the kinds of measures that we have seen for women reflected in the budget. I also think it's an opportunity for us with Chrystia Freeland in that role. It's great to hear a finance minister and a prime minister using words like feminist and she-cession without irony. Although a mentor of mine once told me that when the government starts to sound like you, then it's time to dig deeper and push harder. And I think that after a year of what we've seen, this sort of reversal of decades of gender equity gains, this budget is working to turn that around. But we know right now that the gender equity pieces of this are going to resonate with Minister Freeland on a deeper level than it would if it were to be a man sitting in that position. So we need to make the most of this moment. I think that's what's on my mind.
Anjum, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would agree. And so for everyone listening, this is such a historic moment for our country. It is the biggest budget we've ever really had and I think in the last number of decades. And I think it really starts to think about the crisis point that we're in economically, health-wise, socially. So I think this was a transformative budget for a number of reasons. And to have a woman Minister of Finance table it was significant. And I'll say it's significant for a few reasons. And I want to pick up on a point that Sheila mentioned. Minister Freeland has been talking about her lived experience as a mother and how that gives her interesting insights into this policy issue. Oftentimes there is this, discourse in policy around the evidence and data, and often it does skew a bit more quantitative. And I think this is a recognition that we should be able to bring our whole selves to this work of governing and policymaking. So I think in that in itself was a powerful signal that we can actually talk about ourselves and our identities and how that does give us important and significant analysis and analytical tools to the problems before us. I think another point is, it's important to have that representation, but it's also important it's also important how we do the work. So Minister Freeland, in her role as Canada's Minister of Finance, has been consulting with feminists throughout this pandemic. Our colleagues at Oxfam Canada and a number of feminist organizations got together, requested a meeting with Minister Freeland, and she hosted a roundtable with the feminist movement in Canada. So that also is significant. And we've seen this with Minister Monsef from Women and Gender Equality Canada. We've seen this with Minister Hussein as well. So I think it's important to have that representation. It's also important to change the way we do the work. And I did see that. Now, I think the question is this intersectional enough? And I think that's the conversation we'll have today. I think there's more that could be done, but if I were to give this budget, a score out of 10, I'd give it a 10. Sorry, I would give it an 8 out of 10 to say, this was historic, but there's more work to be done. So that was my perspective on seeing Minister Freeland table this budget.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So to kick us off, let's start the conversation by talking about the big ticket item that's all over the news. So let's start by talking about childcare and early learning funding. Anjum, let's kick it off with you. What are your thoughts on this?
So for folks who have been advocating for childcare, this was the culmination of 5 decades of intensive, steadfast, relentless advocacy. So I really want to do a big shout out to folks at Childcare Now, folks at the Childcare Research Unit. This was something that we have been fighting for in Canada for the last 50 years, half a century. And so the announcement of $30 billion over 5 years of working towards $10 a day child care, that is significant. We've never seen that before. And talking to folks who have been at the front of the childcare movement in Canada, this was a very hopeful sign. And we also saw that this was actually building on what was in the fall economic statement. There was money towards early childhood educators, because it's one thing to create a space for childcare, it's another to make it affordable, but to really make it high quality, you have to invest in the workers. So I saw this commitment as significant. It is a budget document, and typically budget documents don't go into the nitty-gritty details. This was actually a bit more than folks expected, but I think the real battle will be province by province. And we've already heard some provinces kind of stick up their nose on this particular funding that's before us. So I think now it's like, if provinces and territories say no to this money, they have to be held accountable. So I think it was a significant watershed moment for the country, but how it actually happens will be dependent on the provinces and territories.
Great point. Karen, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what Anjum has said. And I think that never before have I read a budget that made me tear up. Reading that commitment to childcare was like, it was a really powerful moment for a lot of us, I think. And, $30 billion over 5 years, it's a huge investment. And I'm thinking about, the impact that this will have, not just for my own family and friends, but women throughout Canada. Like, this is a real game changer. And, what Anjum said is quite right. We need to really recognize the work that the women who have been leading this charge for the last 5 decades have done to get us here today. I'm thinking of folks like Morna Ballantyne in particular, and how much she has put into this in her career. I think that what we have here is the potential to really actually see affordable, accessible, and high quality childcare for families in Canada. The government has committed to working with provincial, territory, and Indigenous partners on a specific Indigenous childcare strategy as well. And when Anjum talks about it being transformative, I think, like, to put it into perspective, we're talking about a project that's on a scale with the work that previous generations have done to build the public school system, to build public health care in Canada. Like, this is big. This is a big, big deal. I think our focus now really needs to be on making sure that the provinces take this up and spend the money as they should, and deliver on it. And, it would be, it's true that we've seen different, provincial responses, and it's kind of wild to me. It's like the federal government is saying, here is all this money, like go and do it. And it's an incredibly popular public policy move. So I think it's inevitable that it's gonna happen. And keeping childcare workers at the center of this, making sure that this is a decent work proposition for them, that's really, really crucial to make sure that this plays out in the way that it should. So very, very exciting.
Great points. Sheila, what are your thoughts and reactions on this? And they did reference a little bit about working with Indigenous partners, but yeah, I'd love to hear your reactions.
Yeah, and I feel and agree with the excitement from Anjum and Karen on it. I think this is historic. It's good that this government and Chrystia Freeland and everyone behind it didn't let a good pandemic go to waste and use this crisis to highlight what needs to be done with families. We see many Zoom calls. I've been on Zoom calls all year long, much like everybody else. And usually there's children behind that, because women are staying home more often than men to take care of their children, to teach them, to make sure that they're not, alone. So I think this was very smart and very timely. I think that they would have got a lot of backlash if they hadn't done this. They should have done this a long time ago, but better late than never, and hopefully it goes good. But we're also making assumptions that there are jobs for women to need daycare, right? That's also a big assumption, especially Indigenous women. We're underemployed and we have fewer opportunities to participate. We've been shut out of the economy in so many ways and access to it. So, I'm glad that there's going to be investment in Indigenous, parts of childcare and early childhood learning. I'm glad about that. There also needs to be more emphasis, as Anjum said, on training these people that will work in the industry, but also being creative on how we deliver. Does it have to be traditional childcare from now on? Because I know for Indigenous families, the most important childcare of all is with relatives. And is there a way that we can still use our relatives, especially grandparents? Now, speaking as a cookum now, brand new, 10 months in, I would love to spend my whole day keeping my grandson, but how is that going to pay the bills for my daughter, who is an entrepreneur? I always say little, but she's a big personality. And is there a way that we can be creative and support different forms of childcare, paying other family members to do this, especially in isolated communities when we don't have infrastructure necessarily to have a daycare all the time? So why don't we get creative and just keep moving forward on that? So that's what I think.
I love it. I love that. I think that creativity is such an important component of this, and because there's so many different models and ways that childcare is delivered culturally and geographically. When I saw this, I was very, hopeful, and the historic impact of this definitely resonated with me. But it makes me also think of kind of two things that it could potentially have negative impacts on: is women entrepreneurs and small business owners of for-profit childcare models, because this is a model that they're only applying this to for the nonprofit. So you have to be like a registered nonprofit childcare provider. And then also accessibility, and particularly in Alberta, we have high rates of for-profit childcare providers, and the majority of those are female entrepreneurs and women small business owners. And if they're using a model like Quebec, which is very values-based, it's the idea that everyone, doesn't matter your income, where you are, you should have, and you have a right to access childcare, which is fantastic. But if you exclude those for-profits, then you'll have to ensure that the nonprofit care is dedicated to those who need it the most, or maybe the most marginalized. Otherwise, what happened in Alberta a few years back when we piloted a universal childcare model, it wasn't needs-based. So we had folks that were accessing the more affordable care in the nonprofit model that didn't need that. They could have gone to the for-profit system, right? So it created some kind of unintended negative impacts there. So I'd like to see the government factor that in and be more creative around that, to try to ensure that they don't end up hurting women-owned and operated small business childcare providers, and also ensure that there's the capacity, greater capacity for those that need it, and accessibility.
And Marcy, just one more quick point on
Yeah.
that. I think we're putting a lot of hope and a lot of trust in the provinces. In our province here in Manitoba, we have issues with how decisions are made at the provincial level when it comes to Indigenous people. And so that's not always fair. It's not always collaborative. And so I worry that if they're given too much power, which they already are, I think that creates problems and inequities.
Really great point. We have a question that came into a follow-up question about how do we hold our provincial government accountable to ensure that the money is delivered in childcare? So do you have any advice on what folks can do to lobby or try to influence?
Well, for me, I would say that collaboration and working with Indigenous partners is key. You can't leave us out of anything anymore. Nothing about us without us. It's been too long where decisions have been made. And I'm glad that this budget had a lot of input from places like Canadian Centre for Aboriginal Business and other Indigenous groups like that to give them an indication of what Indigenous people face even today, and the hardships caused by the pandemic especially. So I think a lot of collaboration is definitely needed and will go a long way. And I would say that on everything, on all the platforms of decision making going forward. It's been too long and things take so much longer to get to a different level or to get buy-in from Indigenous people. And I'm talking about industries as well. When you just start making decisions and say, here it is, live with it, do something with it. And that's not going to work anymore going forward. There's too many educated Indigenous people now.
Yeah, the other part I want to add to Sheila's comments is also around the importance of putting conditionalities on this money. It has to be money that's dedicated to childcare. It can't be used for other aspects or other issues. And it has to also, all the provinces need to move towards a common vision. So, is there a conversation around what are the standards of care that we would expect across the country? So it doesn't matter if I go to a childcare spot in British Columbia or in Nova Scotia, am I going to get the same experience? Or can I hope to have the same quality experience for my child, for example? So I think those are some of the things that we need to be pushing for. And I think provincially, I think this is a place where, and this is what, every order of government has different responsibilities. So if we're finding province by province, they're not stepping up to the plate, that's where local advocacy needs to happen. And if people want to see this childcare system happen, I think this is one of those big national projects similar to Medicare that started off in Saskatchewan and expanded across the country. We need to push, and we need to also be part of the kind of process as residents on this land.
Yeah, and I would just add to that as well. I mean, I think that in this context, the argument to provincial governments is clear, right? The pandemic has shown us how necessary childcare is. We have women dropping out of the workforce in droves, moving from paid to unpaid work. This is an economic issue in as much as it's a social policy issue. So, I mean, I think there are different levers to push to try to work with governments that may be reluctant in different ways. We just need to determine what that is and then push forward from there.
Fantastic. There's one other question. Did the budget cover investment for higher wages for childcare providers or not? I don't believe it specified that, but anyone have thoughts? Because that's something that would also be really important to advocate for, to ensure that with the subsidized childcare rates, that it doesn't come out of the wages of the childcare workers.
Absolutely. And, it was not fully detailed around how they're going to put money towards wages. They did actually highlight, though, how low the wages are of these essential workers, right? Delivering essential labor. So I think that's a recognition that, they're not being paid enough and we need to raise the bar. And I would also say, the research shows us conditions of work are the conditions of care. So if you have someone benefits and good wages, that actually creates better outcomes for the quality of care that they provide. So I think it's also part of the quality conversation.
Fantastic. Okay, so moving on to the next question. The budget included funding to end gender-based violence and the first ever national action plan to end gender-based violence. What are your thoughts on this? Is it an intersectional approach? And what do you think needs to be done? So let's kick it off with Sheila as a strong advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the creator of the MMIW hashtag. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I'm glad that there's an acknowledgement that gender-based violence has been a problem, and increasingly during the pandemic. And most of what I read online and even on social media from people who experienced it is their job site shuts down, they go home, and pressures mount, and domestic violence, if it was mild, it got red hot and really bad, and there was nowhere to go a lot of times. So I'm glad that there is acknowledgement of that, but we need to do more than just build shelters. We need to support women in ways that they can become independent and not be vulnerable to the things around them and the things that they don't have access to. I'm sure every woman that's stuck and is being subjected to violence wishes that they could have their own place, not just a shelter. And shelters are important for the very short term, but we need to make sure that there are training opportunities, employment opportunities, childcare opportunities that will help women become less vulnerable and gain more independence. And I think that the funds also, there were specific ones for the Inquirer report, the MMIW, and implementation of it. And I know there's work across Canada from different committees that are looking at the different parts of different sections of what causes MMIW and what keeps it going. And I'm looking forward to the work from that, and I'm hoping and anticipating that we'll hear about it more in the next couple of weeks or months. But definitely we needed to see that, and I'm glad that the government has gone to the community for consultation on moving forward on that and ending violence. But again, the more that we can support our women to stand on their own, to take care of their children, the stronger our communities will be and our nations. And I think that's been the biggest thing for Indigenous women, especially, is that they didn't have access to take care of their own needs, and then they become, subjected to violence.
Excellent points. Let's go to Karen next.
Yeah, I think this is another one of those budget commitments that is like a big legacy piece. It has the potential to be, and has been something that gender justice and women's rights advocates have been calling on for a really, really long time. So what we see in the investment is it's a big one, $601 million for this National Action Plan. A small part of that, 14 million, is for the development of the plan, and then the rest of it is for the action items and implementation involved with it. Arguably, that 14 million could have been bigger. There's like a lot of work to do to create this plan and make sure that it's robust and inclusive. But very happy to welcome the 200 million for organizations to respond to gender-based violence in their communities and families, crisis hotline money, prevention initiatives, and notably some specific funding for 2S LGBTQ+ organizations and Indigenous-led organizations, which is good to see. Also, arguably could be more associated with that. But I think what Sheila's describing is quite important around the increase of gender-based violence during the pandemic. A number of international organizations are referring to this as the shadow pandemic, these really skyrocketing rates of male violence against women and gender diverse people in these times of stress. So to answer, I was thinking about your question, Marcy, is it intersectional enough? And I read that question to mean, like, will this plan be enough to address sort of disproportionate impacts of violence that women and gender diverse people are facing, and who are experiencing these layers of oppression that you described at the beginning: racism, ableism, homophobia, ageism, all of that. And I think the answer to that question is that it remains to be seen. We can't really tell from the budget, commitment here. The government is using the language of advancing progress. And I think that's pretty much exactly right, exactly where we are in this budget. The federal government is pulling together all of the federal departments that need to feed into this, and they're starting to gather community level feedback. I know YW was really involved in that, Women's Shelters Canada leading the way on that as well. And I think, to be truly inclusive, there needs to be Black, Indigenous, racialized women, disabled women, older women, all really strongly represented in the development of this plan. And we need to do it in a way that's really intentional and inclusive of those voices. So I think from the Canadian Women's Foundation perspective, we're welcoming this move. We're going to reserve judgment on its effectiveness in terms of intersectionality until we see how it plays out in the coming months and years.
Thank you. Excellent. And Jim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, economic recovery cannot happen in a climate of hate and violence. And I think the fact that this is the year we're actually getting this significant investment in a national action plan to end gender-based violence is a recognition of that from this government. Having said that, it was a bit less than what we were expecting in the feminist movement. So that's, of course, we're hoping more money will be put into this, because this is something that's going to be worked on for the next 10 years. And I should say the feminist movement has been calling for this for some time. So we're actually about 6 years late. The United Nations had been calling on all countries to implement a national action plan by 2015. So, we're working on it, which is great. It's going to come out later this year and some by Women and Gender Equality Canada. But, some would say if we had that plan back then, maybe some of the things that we're seeing in this country around the rise in gender-based violence and the families and lives that have been impacted would have been reduced. So I think this is also a helpful point to remember that many of the things that we're understanding and being revealed by the pandemic were issues well before. And to be honest, we should take a public health approach to all of these issues, right? Prevention is better. And that's what we need to be doing and working upstream. And I think, in terms of the intersectionality of this plan, I think, again, this is something that requires consistent consultation with diverse communities across the country on an ongoing basis, not just one-off. So that's something I'm hoping for the next 10 years. When the plan gets revealed, there's also a conversation. How are we going to come back and look at this plan? What does accountability look like? What are the targets? How do we measure success? And I think another element to this too is one of the disappointments in this budget from an analysis that diverse queer communities have put out. They were disappointed in the lack of funding, limited funding for queer communities. So they were hoping to see, 20 million a year. What we saw in the budget was 15 million spread out over 3 years. So again, queer communities are doing essential work to address homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, and other forms of oppression. And that is a form of gender-based violence. So I think we need to also start to recognize that. And I'll put a link in the chat of an excellent analysis that Wisdom to Action put out, looking at the budget through LGBTQ lens and the disappointment they saw in that realm.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for raising that. I read something and chatted with a colleague this morning about that, and how on average the government of Canada has about around a $200 million budget annually for pride festivals across the country. And now this budget only has 15 million over 3 years to increase community capacity, which is like improving community-based services, mental health care, access to healthcare services, and how inadequate that is for the communities across the country. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs and small businesses. The budget commits $146.9 million over 4 years to strengthen the women entrepreneurship strategy, to greater access to financing, mentorship, and training, It also recognizes, it says right in the budget, in the section, that only 36% of Indigenous-led businesses are owned by women. And to address this, they plan to invest $22 million over 3 years. So what are your thoughts on this and your reactions to this? Let's start with Karen.
Sure. Yeah, I think another important dimension to the statistic that you shared about Indigenous women's representation among entrepreneurs is that many entrepreneurs who are women, including Indigenous women, are often running businesses that are really, really small. So maybe with just a couple of employees, 1 or 2, or maybe they're running it independently just by themselves. And, you know, women across the board, and women, Indigenous women in particular, are less likely to seek and receive business financing than men. And they're also less likely to receive venture capital and angel investing. This is because of discrimination and sexism and racism and all of these intersecting oppressions that we've talked about. Who is seen as having a viable business to support, what our baked in biases are around what good business looks like. And so these folks often rely on government programs and grants to get their businesses off the ground in the first place. So it's really great that the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, NACA, has this funding that it can flow through to various Indigenous financial institutions to, get to the entrepreneurs. And we hope that there'd be a strong gender lens on the way that that's administered. I recently learned that the Indigenous Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative at NACA was started by one woman with $0, as is the case with many, many important programs for women across the country. So it's a really important initiative, and we're glad to see it expanded. And again, I mean, we can come back once again to pandemic and how hard women-owned businesses have been hit. And a lot of women entrepreneurs didn't qualify for the various government supports and programs on offer because their operations were so small. So, looking at supports for women entrepreneurs, I think it's great. It's great to see. And I'm actually super interested to hear what Sheila has to say about this too, because Sheila, I know we mentioned that your daughter's an entrepreneur. I believe you are involved in a number of entrepreneurial ventures as well. So yeah, it would be great to hear your thoughts too.
Well, I was raised by an entrepreneur. Thank you for that, Karen. My dad raised us as a family, just being self-employed. So I draw lots of inspiration from his experiences and the things that he did. And my mom as well. She was, of course, staying home, but to me, she was the partner to my dad in the business that he had carried for 40 years. So I have a lot of good memories and good thoughts about entrepreneurship. So, and I did own my own business for a while until I couldn't do it anymore. My kids were still too young to get them through the ebb and flows with me. So I got a traditional job and yada, 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 here I am. But I do want to get back into entrepreneurship because I do love it. And I think it's the key to building our communities. And more women are getting into entrepreneurship, including my daughter, and I support her in every way that I can. And partly because, and this is where I wanted to make a point is, and when you said, Karen, that that people, entrepreneurs, are going to non-traditional forms of finding financing, because banks are so closed and so they only think a certain way. And so non-traditional forms have come and filled that role of being that bridge financer and the financer, because banks are too rigid. So maybe it's time for banks to start thinking differently and being creative as well. And part of the biggest reason in all of that is that Indigenous people en masse and in general have been economically starved. So we don't have necessarily grandparents, parents that leave us a legacy or an egg to start with, and we don't have savings accounts that are $100,000 so we can start investing in our own business. We don't have anything like that in general for the most part. So whatever we scrap together is usually very small compared to other business entrepreneurs that are starting up. And I would say that with education as well, we're always behind 2 or 3 years behind, or in every level, that it takes a lot longer sometimes to catch up, and so we have to be really creative and work extra hard to get where we need to be. So I think wherever we come across Indigenous owned businesses, especially women, let's support them as much as we can. Let's think of ways we can utilize their business, and if they don't meet the necessary needs that you need, maybe there is room for feedback. Procurement is also a huge thing. Let's not just make it like a patronizing thing and say, oh, let's use you for whatever. Make it a real thing and let Indigenous women and entrepreneurs in general show you. I think that's been a huge saver for us as Indigenous people. In spite of all the history and everything that we faced, entrepreneurial thinkers have saved our communities and our families even to this day, and they need a lot more support, and I'm glad that there's more people talking about that.
Fantastic. Let's go to Anjum.
Yeah, just to build on that point around procurement, government is also a business. They have services and goods and other things that they need to buy. So why don't they put an equity lens on it? And I saw in this budget, there were actually measures there around procurement. I saw a specific focus on Black entrepreneurs, a continued focus on Indigenous entrepreneurs. And I think they're starting to look at their entrepreneurship, their procurement strategy through that equity lens. But I think this is something we need to push other levels of government to do as well. Every single level of government, they should be having some sort of procurement lens that looks at gender, equity, inclusion, looks at it through an intersectional lens. And that's something that all of us, sometimes, these pushes for advocacy seem so insurmountable. How do we get this big government to change? The fact is, every single place that you're in across the country, I know many folks on the call from across the country, that's something you could push your local elected official. Hey, how is the city actually, how is our municipality actually investing in women-led businesses? Can we have a conversation about that? So I think that's something where, yes, the federal government has shown some signal changing there, but that's something we can push our local governments too.
Fantastic. Okay, so there is a section in the budget, moving to our next question, on fighting systemic racism and empowering communities, which was really exciting to see. A response to the past year of racism and sexism sort of exploding alongside COVID-19. So this included funding for Black Canadian communities, $8 million for the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and helping communities respond to an increase in racism. So I'd love to kick it off with Anjum. I also saw there was a reference in there to propose amendments to the Public Service Employment Act to affirm the importance of diverse and inclusive workforce and avoid biases and barriers in hiring within the public service, but there wasn't any details around that. And I didn't see the dollar amount associated with it in there, but Anjum, what are your thoughts on this section?
Yeah, and on the public service change, yeah, I did see that amendment change and no money towards that. And it's important to change legislation or reaffirm, but it's even better to put resources behind it, because as we know, money speaks more volumes than, let put your money where your mouth is. There we go. That's the saying I'm going to say. But in terms of, addressing systemic racism, we saw a lot of language of that throughout the document. And I think that was, again, in response to the rise of hate crimes that we've seen across the country. In particular, we've seen a rise against Asian Canadians, Black Canadians, and other racialized communities. We've also seen continued rise in impacts on Indigenous communities, and that's something that has been very much spoken about in the media. So I think this is perhaps in recognition of that. I think the question is, how are they going to work with grassroots communities? So there is a government agency or a crown corporation of the government that they're providing funds to, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and that's important. We need to build up the capacity of this agency of the government. However, we need to make sure that grassroots communities who've been doing this work on a volunteer basis, tracking incidents of hate, responding to hate, thinking about different campaigns to address it, they need to be invested in as well. So my hope would be, yes, this money goes to expand the government's actions around this, but also that money goes directly to community groups who know best how to leverage those funds and support their communities. I think something else that we're going to see later on this year is legislation around online hate. So hate happens physically in person. It also happens online. And when I think about virtually, we're all meeting together. It's been the place where we go to school, go to work, socialize. We need these spaces to be safe as well. But oftentimes when someone experiences hate online, they don't know what to do next. They experience that trauma by themselves. There's no recourse. It's confusing. Who do you go to? Is it the police? Is it the RCMP? It's unclear. So I think that's something I would hope that this money also starts to talk about.
Excellent. Sheila, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm glad to see again that there's addressing at least that systemic racism. And I think the pandemic and the systemic racism and the racism itself came together and exposed a lot of things, a lot of systems, and a lot of people even. And I'm glad that we're able to talk about it more now, because it is really detrimental and it is killing people. And it's not something that can be ignored every day or any longer. And I'm also reminded that there are those TRC calls to action that have been in our system and in our midst, and the era of reconciliation is still here. So if we started to implement at every level the calls to action and the inquiry report into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which has 213 calls to action, I think we all need to find our place and where we fit in all of these calls to action and start to address what we can do to end systemic racism and call it out every time and support people that are calling it out. And also how we incorporate Indigenous knowledge, for example, in businesses. And I think diversity is important. We need to put faces of Indigenous people and people of color at every level, from the boardroom to the front lines of any business, to all the different levels. And but diversity doesn't necessarily address the systemic racism. That's a huge, deeply rooted issue that all of us as Canadians have been subjected to learning from early in ages, saying that it's okay to disregard Indigenous people. And we know that this is true. It's been infused in our education system, and that's why we see it openly in healthcare, in justice, in all of these different places. And so that has a longer way to go. And I know that corporations are scratching their head trying to figure out what to do. I have been asked by many big corporations to do talks 1 hour here and there to start to conversation on what systemic racism is, what Indigenous history is, all those things. And I'm happy to do it. And I'm really glad people are interested and people are signing on to learn. But it has to be more than that, not just 1 hour sessions here and there, and then your organization is done. We need to do more. For example, I just talked to a CEO just before I got on this call, and she's like bad ASS. And she's one of those people that are very strong, but yet she gets paid 35% less than her male counterparts. And she's an Indigenous woman. And how much more powerful would she be if she got the same level of respect and support on the work that she does, if she was given that opportunity and taken off all those systemic racism and thoughts of patronizing them. And I think, this is a deep rooted problem with many good solutions that are out there that need to be done. And also, it's not Indigenous people's job to educate necessarily all the time. I love doing it, and I'm glad I'm doing it. It gives me great joy. But sometimes I feel overwhelmed, and I think about some of the discussions that some workplaces must have, where there's one Indigenous employee, and then they're expected to know everything, and then they get bombarded That's one thing we learn in when we teach in HR classes that I work with at Legacy Bows, is that it is actually considered harassment if you start talking about someone's race or beliefs openly in a workplace, and then you don't have a safe outlet for them. It's actually something that could be detrimental. So it can't be done openly. It has to be done strategically in a meaningful way, and big businesses and small businesses and policymakers need to get on board. The RCMP needs to get on board to end systemic racism and understand what it is. So I'm glad that we're talking about it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Karen.
Yeah, both what Sheila and Anjum have offered is really, really rich. And I think there's a lot of things that we need to unpack around systemic racism in our communities. Just thinking about even what you were just saying, Sheila, around the RCMP and other institutions where these racist ways of thinking and, acting are so baked in that it's not even seen. So I feel nervous about things like giving police forces money to investigate systemic racism within their own ranks when they don't necessarily even recognize that it's there. There's some red flags around that kind of thing.
And the illusion of feminism and intersectionality, even though she's at that, and we know who we're talking about, it still doesn't represent equality, and it doesn't represent inclusion and all that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I hear you. I think you're right. And I noticed in the budget document they had included Joyce Echaquan's name and, talked about the need for health systems navigation and, health advocates and that kind of thing around Indigenous women's safety. But, I think it's so much deeper than, providing advocacy and care in that way for people. It's rooting out the causes of things like that should never happen. People should not die in that way. So I think there's a lot there, and I feel like I'm getting a little bit off track, but I think Anjum's right that it would have been really important to see dedicated funding here for grassroots organizations that are doing this work on the daily, on the ground. In the pandemic context, yes, anti-Asian racism has been rampant, and that the communities are responding to it themselves, and it's a huge burden on them to have to do that kind of response. I worry right now about and I think we've heard this echoed in the South Asian community, worrying about anti-South Asian racism incidents increasing in the wake of travel restrictions imposed on India and Pakistan yesterday. So I think there's a lot to be concerned about there. I will say, though, that it is great to see the funding directed toward Black Canadian communities in different ways. The conversation on anti-Black racism has really been taken up by mainstream organizations and media in important ways in the last year. So, there are some encouraging signs, but I mean, there's a long way to go on this one.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all for those insights. So I'm going to, we're trying to touch on a lot of different topics here. But I want to make sure that I ask you, what is missing? What was completely missing? And what are some additional recommendations you have and that you'd like to see? So let's kick it off with Anjum.
So I had mentioned, for example, wisdom to action and some of the perspectives on the lack of robust funding for LGBTQ plus communities. Another aspect that we have heard from our coalition partner, the National Association of Friendship Centers, is the lack of recognition of urban Indigenous communities. So that was also something that was missing in the budget. And NAFC was expecting more, and I'll put their link in the chat. And so that's something that we as coalition partners are supporting NFC and calling for more money. I think also something that was missing is for young people who have graduated in this moment of pandemic, this is not how they expected to start off their adult lives. And I think in the budget, there was a lack of ambition around recognizing the unique impacts of this crisis on people earlier on in their lives. There was money towards, waiving student loans by a year, money towards reskilling programs for young people. That is all well and good and very much appreciated. But I think there was a lack of recognition of what a significant life event this is. And can you imagine, right? When you're just starting off in your schooling or your work life, you don't have as much social capital. So if you were to lose your job, and young people have been the first laid off, you can't really bounce back in the same way. And so I think there's a lack of recognition and ambition in the budget on that. And we will certainly be pushing the government to do more on that front.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Let's go to Sheila.
I think what Anjum said about the National Association of Friendship Centers, it's similar to what I think we need to do, invest in centers of excellence for Indigenous people, and especially young people and women. We need to find a way so they could have a dedicated avenue and system to get them up to speed and start to include them in the economic recovery. Like I said before earlier on, we've been subjected to economic shutout for many years, and we're not at a level playing field. So we need to do more to address that and to start putting real initiatives that our own people can ascribe to, but also design, and maybe that needs to happen with other cultures as well, that their centers of excellence need to happen. I know that there are here and there community centers that do this and that, and that they support, for example, getting resumes built and basic education, but we need to do that more in a big way, especially going forward. We need systems that are designed by people and then incorporated and then also implemented. And the National Association of Friendship Centers would have been a good one for sure to invest in, because a lot of people rely on them for different things. And a group here in Manitoba and Winnipeg, Mom Away, is also a big supporter of urban Indigenous people. And I'm glad that they're being utilized in many ways now. It's been a struggle to get them, I think, up to that level, but we need to see more of that and supports at that level as well, and specifically urban Indigenous people. And education also is a big part of that. And so I know that there are some dollars for education, but we also need different forms of training. Where I work now at Legacy Bows, we do offer training for leadership skills and other type of skills, but there wasn't, and even while we were at home, there could have been time spent training people on different skills while they were at home, not being able to go to the office, for example. So again, I would say we need to be more creative and think outside the box, and especially now.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much. Karen.
Yeah, when we look at this budget, we see commitments around all kinds of really important things: childcare, long-term care, some support for PSWs. We see a $15 federal minimum wage. We didn't even touch on that yet today. Like lots of welcome and necessary measures. But something that I think that needs to accompany these measures around folks who are working in the care economy is, who is filling these essential roles that are keeping everything afloat. So we're largely talking here about racialized women, many of whom have precarious migration status or are undocumented and extremely vulnerable to exploitation and violence in their workplaces. We're also talking about farm workers, and a lot of farm workers, migrant farm workers, are women. And I think that that's often assumed not to be the case, but it's really true that they are. And their conditions of work have been dire for a really, really long time. And what we've seen in the last year is COVID absolutely ravaging their cramped bunkhouses, and they're at the same time as their employers, protest the imposition of quarantine measures. So for these workers, many of these budget commitments that we're celebrating and talking about would not even apply. So we need to, I think, pick up and amplify and push really hard on calls for permanent status on arrival for migrants that are coming to Canada. Migrants' rights advocates have been calling on this for more than a generation. And I think of the call for permanent status on arrival as akin to the women's sector's call for quality and affordable national childcare. It's the thing that will make all the difference, and like people's lives are literally depending on it. So I think that's one thing that, you know, in all of the budget measures, that's a glaring miss.
Can we also say that we need to support the initiatives to raise more Indigenous women leaders, or women leaders in general too? We know that that makes a huge difference in communities. We see the effects of that ourselves with Christa Friel in there. And how much more would our communities be thriving and be more healthy if we saw that? And specifically with Indigenous women, I think we think more in a global or in a big way when we're leading. We go from A to Z, and then we try to bring everyone at the same time together. Whereas men traditionally go from A to B and then they're done. And not to knock them off, because there's different skill sets needed for different situations. But for women, I think that we're more inclusive in our leadership than men are. And again, I don't want to say disparaging things about men, because I love our men, but I think that we need to support more leadership initiatives for women.
Fantastic. That's a great point. And we are running out of time, but this has been a really inspiring and incredible discussion. Some key common themes are our hopes for creativity in this budget, and creativity in the implementation and interpretation of it, the importance of co-creating and co-implementing with community, also recognizing that women are not a homogeneous group, and we can't advance gender equality unless we take an intersectional approach, and we can't call this feminist unless it truly is intersectional. But there is a lot of hope that is in this budget, that is really built upon strong legacies of community advocates and strong women across Canada. So thank you everyone so much for participating. Huge thank you to Sheila, Anjum, and Karen. Yeah, I wish I could give everyone a hug. Up next, there's the debates to come in committees about the budget, and then once it passes, and maybe there'll be iterations, we'll see, but keep apprised to the developments, and then we'll see, hopefully we can influence our provincial governments and municipal governments on how they can take this up and really move this forward as well. And on our side for next steps, we're taking copious notes throughout this session, and we'll be working with Anjum, Sheila, and Karen on compiling them, creating like a little mini report that then we can release with further recommendations to the government about this budget. So thank you everyone for attending.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.
And
Have a great day.
thank you.
Okay, bye.